my own way.
What the fuck, dude? We've been here doing this for 14 years.
The last 5 felt like 20.
The powers that be, they were not having it. It took me 5 years of literally begging to do a crossover with Chip Foods.
Richard Rawlings, once a symbol of success in the automotive industry and the star of the popular TV show Fast and Loud, now finds himself at the center of a scandal that has exposed the darkest secrets never before revealed after a 3-week trial. He faced a shocking sentence no one could have predicted right in the courtroom. As the verdict was read, Rawlings suddenly collapsed, forcing everyone present to witness an unforgettable scene. What led a man, once famous and admired in the world of classic cars, to fall into such a tragic situation? The dark secrets behind Gas Monkey Garage and Fast and Loud have now been exposed, revealing not only financial fraud, but also a large-scale conspiracy to defraud the classic car industry. From a symbol of success, Rawlings now faces an irreversible downfall. Why did he risk it all, only to face such a horrifying sentence? Let's uncover the truth behind this shocking case and the dark secrets of Gas Monkey Garage that few people knew about. The unexpected event in court. On the day scheduled for trial at the Federal Court of Northern Texas, the atmosphere in courtroom 4A became tense and suffocatingly silent. All eyes were focused on Richard Rawlings, once known as a legend in the classic car community and the founder of Gas Monkey Garage. As he faced the judgment from Judge Alan I. Simmons before the sentence was read, Rawlings sat still, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes became blurry, no longer reflecting the confidence and heroic demeanor he once displayed on television and at public appearances. The image of a man who dared to face any challenge had now given way to tension and anxiety, almost unrecognizable. The 3-week trial had been so tense that everyone in the room could feel Rawlings' anxiety. He had previously been a model of success, a man of adventure with classic cars, but now all he could do was sit silently, looking at the court's bulletin board, waiting for the verdict to be delivered. As Judge Simmons began reading the sentence, the atmosphere in the courtroom became heavy, with no sound except the distant ticking of a clock. Everyone knew this was the decisive moment, not just for Rawlings, but for everything he had built over the year. After a few minutes of reading the verdict, the judge announced the result. Richard Rawlings was found guilty of all charges, including fraud through wire transfers, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and tax evasion. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. On top of that, Rawlings was ordered to pay a financial fine exceeding $26 million, a colossal amount that would not only ruin his reputation, but also plunge him into an irreparable financial downfall. When this announcement was made, Rawlings' reaction was not what anyone had expected. He did not speak out in protest, nor did he offer any defense. He simply collapsed, his eyes blurry, his body lacking strength. Suddenly, in a moment that no one in the courtroom had time to process, Rawlings slumped forward onto the desk. The sound of his heavy breathing, followed by the noise of his face hitting the desk, created a horrifying sound. It took several seconds for those present to react. His lawyer, James Westfield, immediately called for medical assistance. Medical personnel rushed in, while security staff quickly cleared the area to ensure safety. This scene left everyone in the courtroom stunned, unable to believe what had just occurred. The reactions from the people present ranged from shock, including reporters, court staff, and even Rawlings' friends and family. Even his longtime close friends, such as Dennis Collins, could do nothing but watch from a distance, worried but unable to approach. As medical personnel carried Rawlings out of the courtroom, no one could have imagined that a man who had once been a symbol of success and progress could end in such a tragic way. There was no excitement, no applause, only a suffocating silence. A man who had built his empire from a career in the classic car industry now faced total collapse. The court and all those who witnessed this event were in shock. Rawlings' conviction was not only a legal sentence, but also the end of an era in which Gas Monkey Garage and Fast and Loud had once been a household name in the car enthusiast community. Investigation and charges. The collapse of Richard Rawlings in the courtroom was not only a shock for fans and followers of the show Fast and Loud, but it also marked a significant milestone in the criminal investigation into the shady business activities behind the glamorous facade of Gas Monkey Garage. Notably, the investigation did not begin immediately, but rather started accidentally through a routine tax audit at the end of 2023. When the IRS began reviewing Gas Monkey Garage's financial records, there was initially nothing more than ordinary suspicions about the spending and debts of a large business. However, as the investigation progressed, more and more unusual signs emerged that the investigators could not ignore. The initial audit was simply meant to examine unpaid taxes by Gas Monkey Garage. However, as IRS agents delved deeper into the financial records, they uncovered unexplained expenses and large debts that could not be accounted for, some of which appeared to be related to Rawlings' personal transactions and unreasonable costs for an automotive business. The connection between Rawlings' personal debts and the business's expenses began to raise questions about the transparency of Gas Monkey Garage's financial operations. Signs began to emerge suggesting that something far more serious was taking place. As the investigation stretched on, investigators began noticing clearer signs of financial fraud. One of the first discoveries was the presence of international bank accounts, which appeared to be unconnected to the regular business activities of Gas Monkey Garage. This suggested that international transactions had been made without proper oversight or transparency. However, this was just the beginning, and the case quickly expanded when investigators discovered an extremely serious issue: fraud involving the alteration of vehicle identification numbers. VINs for classic cars, a criminal act that could expose Rawlings to charges related to wire fraud, mail fraud, and media-related deception. This discovery was a huge shock. Investigators found that Rawlings and his associates had used sophisticated methods to alter the VINs of dozens of classic cars, transforming ordinary vehicles into rare versions worth much more than their actual value. Once these cars had their VINs and documentation altered, they could be valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions for special editions. This was not just simple fraud. It was a systematic network of deception carried out over many years. Involving numerous people, prosecutors presented evidence in court that Rawlings had not only sold cars with fake VINs, but had also created fake histories for them, making them appear to be valuable classic cars. This caused an uproar in the car enthusiast community. These cars were sold to collectors and wealthy buyers who were unaware of their fraudulent nature. One of the key pieces of evidence in the case was footage from Fast and Loud, in which Rawlings proudly showcased the rare cars he had found. These clips were used by the prosecutors to demonstrate that Rawlings had exploited his fame and reputation in the automotive industry as a basis for these fraudulent actions. What made the case even more complicated and noteworthy was the involvement of automotive experts and witnesses from classic car auctions who provided crucial evidence. They pointed out that the cars sold by Rawlings and Gas Monkey Garage displayed subtle but obvious differences from the original versions of classic cars, differences that could only be recognized by seasoned experts in the field. These changes were not simple fakes, but sophisticated tricks performed by individuals with deep expertise in cars, making the fraudulent activities even harder to detect. This further confirmed that the case was not just about a few cars, but represented a large-scale fraudulent strategy carried out over a prolonged period. Experts and witnesses pointed out that Rawlings was not just a classic car enthusiast, but also a sophisticated fraudster, using his fame and influence to cover up systematic fraudulent activities. The evidence presented by the prosecutors in court not only showed serious legal violations, but also a public deception of the classic car community and collectors throughout the investigation. The prosecutors clarified that Rawlings had not only altered VINs and documentation for the classic cars, but had also employed a sophisticated marketing strategy to legitimize the cars he had fabricated. Footage from Fast and Loud and advertising activities across media channels helped Rawlings reach a large audience of fans and customers, making them trust the authenticity of the cars he sold. These investigations not only shed light on a classic car fraud system, but also illustrated how celebrities could leverage their influence to carry out large-scale deception. This case not only raised questions about Auntie in the automotive industry, but also forced many to re-examine their trust in television programs that were once familiar and beloved by the public, the last-ditch effort to save himself. As the trial faced serious charges, Richard Rawlings' defense team could not sit idly by. They did everything they could to protect their client, even though the evidence against him grew clearer and more overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Rawlings' defense team presented arguments to mitigate his punishment, but these efforts seemed insufficient to overcome the weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution. One of the key arguments raised by Rawlings' defense team was to assert that he was simply a classic car enthusiast, with no intention of committing fraud in his dealings. They claimed that the differences between the versions of classic cars Rawlings had crafted and sold were merely an issue of authenticity within the car industry. Where differing opinions about the authenticity of a vehicle are common, Rawlings' lawyer, James Westfield, firmly stated that Rawlings was not the only one in the industry with a different view on how to authenticate a classic car, and that the act of improving or altering certain parts of a vehicle did not necessarily constitute fraud. Westfield argued that selling cars with subtle modifications was an accepted practice within the automotive industry, and that Rawlings never intended to harm customers or the car enthusiast community. The defense sought to portray Rawlings as a true classic car enthusiast, not a sophisticated fraudster, as the prosecution had painted him. Westfield even emphasized that Rawlings had built his career on honesty and a commitment to restoring classic cars with integrity. He argued that Rawlings had never intended to deceive his customers, and all the actions in question were mere mistakes in the process of authentication, not part of a deliberate fraudulent scheme. However, the defense's arguments failed to convince the jury. While Rawlings' defense team attempted to clarify the complexities of the classic car industry and how the values of cars are assessed, the prosecutors quickly dismissed all of these points. Prosecutor Daniel Keller pointed out that altering VINs and documentation of classic cars was a clear illegal act, and there was no justification for these actions. He emphasized that Rawlings had used sophisticated tricks to forge the cars, thereby causing significant harm to collectors and wealthy buyers who trusted his credibility. The prosecution presented a very different picture of Rawlings. They argued that Rawlings was not just a classic car enthusiast but a deliberate fraudster, using the Fast and Loud show to market counterfeit cars. Prosecutor Keller even claimed that Rawlings had exploited his fame from television to create an authoritative image for the cars he sold, making customers believe they were purchasing truly valuable vehicles, while in reality these cars were simply altered, counterfeit versions. Additionally, the prosecutor highlighted that Rawlings' use of media and advertising channels to inflate the value of his forged cars was a systematic act of deception. Footage from Fast and Loud, in which Rawlings proudly showcased the rare cars he had found, became a crucial piece of evidence. These clips not only served as proof of Rawlings' deception in his work, but also showed how he had exploited public trust and used his influence to carry out fraudulent activities. One of the most impactful aspects of the trial came from the testimony of witnesses' former employees, who had worked directly with Rawlings at Gas Monkey Garage. 3 former employees took the stand to testify about a secret area in the garage where they had been involved in altering the VINs of vehicles. Their testimony clarified that Rawlings and several of his associates used specialized equipment to alter the VINs of classic cars, thereby turning ordinary cars into rare, high-value vehicles. The witnesses further testified that this area was restricted and off-limits. While Fast and Loud was filming, only Rawlings and a select few trusted associates had access to this area, and it was here that the fraudulent activities took place. As Rawlings' defense team continued to argue about the lack of clarity in the process of authenticating classic cars, the prosecutors relentlessly reinforced their case with strong and compelling evidence. This left the jury no choice but to reject the defense's arguments. Testimonies from industry experts and witnesses painted a clear picture of the systemic fraud Rawlings had been involved in. Ultimately, despite the vigorous efforts from the defense team, the persuasion of the prosecution and the solid evidence they presented led the jury to convict Richard Rawlings. His use of fame and reputation to deceive collectors, Create counterfeit cars and sell them at inflated prices was an act that could not be justified. The final verdict. After everything that had been revealed throughout the 3 weeks of trial, the final verdict for Richard Rawlings was read, marking the end of a tense and complex journey. In stark contrast to the confident and strong image Rawlings had portrayed in episodes of Fast and Loud, he now stood before an unforeseen challenge, not only legally but also in terms of his career, reputation, and the values he had once built. The federal court in northern Texas, where the trial took place, became the focal point for millions of people following the case. The atmosphere in courtroom 4A on the day of sentencing grew eerily silent. Journalists from major TV networks, reporters, and people from the automotive industry were all present to capture the final details of the case. Everyone was in attendance, but no one could have predicted that the trial would end with such a heavy sentence. As Judge Alan I. Simmons began reading the verdict, all eyes turned to Richard Rawlings. A thick silence enveloped the room, with each word from the judge feeling like a heavy blow to Rawlings and the gas monkey garage empire he had spent over a decade building. The final sentence for Rawlings was 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years, along with a financial fine of more than $26 million. This was an extremely severe sentence, not just for the crimes Rawlings faced, but also because of the widespread impact this fraud had within the classic car community and on the businesses involved with Gas Monkey Garage. This verdict was not only a punishment for the systematic fraud Rawlings had carried out over the years, but it also sent a powerful message that no leniency would be given for acts of deception, no matter how famous the person committing them was. This marked not only the collapse of an individual, but also the collapse of a public image that had been carefully crafted over many years. Rawlings, once known as a classic car enthusiast and host of a popular show, who built a powerful empire with Gas Monkey Garage, had now become a symbol of failure, of what can happen when fame and greed collide. Before his conviction, Richard Rawlings had been a major influence in the classic car community and the world of reality television. He was known not only for his ability to restore and repair classic cars, but also for his strong, decisive style and confident demeanor throughout the episodes of Fast and Loud. The show had brought him into the homes of millions of fans who followed his journey of car restoration. For many, Rawlings was not just a celebrity, but also a role model for passion and success. However, this scandal upended everything Rawlings had built over the past decade. His image, once a beacon within the car community, was now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. As the verdict was read, an eerie silence overtook the courtroom. Everyone present at the court understood that it wasn't just Rawlings who would face irreversible consequences. Gas Monkey Garage and Fast and Loud would also have to confront the fallout from this scandal. This was not only the end of a television show, but also the end of an empire built on the trust and belief of fans. Immediately following the announcement of the verdict, Discovery Channel, which aired a month, Fast and Loud issued an official statement expressing shock and disappointment at the verdict handed down to Rawlings. The channel promptly announced that it would be removing all episodes of Fast and Loud from its platform for a full review of the program. They also declared that they would be re-examining all content related to Rawlings and the show to ensure that no fraud or misinformation had been broadcast over the years. They also declared that they would be re-examining all content related to Rawlings and the show to ensure that no fraud or misinformation had been broadcast over the years. Wide-ranging impact on the classic car community. The case of Richard Rawlings not only shattered his personal reputation, but also had a profound impact on the classic car community who had long trusted and admired Gas Monkey Garage for many years. Fast and Loud had been an essential part of the lives of classic car enthusiasts, and Gas Monkey Garage had become a symbol for restoring and recycling vintage cars. For car lovers, the show offered not just entertainment, but also valuable information on how to repair and restore classic cars. However, after the classic car fraud scandal was exposed, the classic car collecting community began to realize that many of the cars sold through Gas Monkey Garage might have been counterfeit. This sparked a wave of dissatisfaction within the community. with many feeling deceived by someone they had once revered. For those who had spent hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars on cars from Gas Monkey Garage, this was a huge shock. Not only had they lost the money they spent, but they also lost their trust in the very industry they loved. The issue was even more serious because these cars were not just collectibles. For classic car collectors, these vehicles were not just assets, but works of art carrying historical and cultural value. When it was revealed that the cars might have had their VINs and documentation altered to fake their value, many felt betrayed. Trust in classic car suppliers, especially famous figures like Rawlings, was shattered, raising the question of whether the classic car industry could ever regain the trust it had lost. This incident also raised questions about the authenticity standards within the classic car industry. Auction houses and experts in the field were forced to reconsider all their car verification processes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Classic car auction companies began to revise their authentication procedures, requiring that all documentation and paperwork be more thoroughly checked. Some companies even introduced stricter VIN verification measures to ensure that the cars sold were legitimate and not fraudulent, like those in Rawlings' case. The impact of this case extended beyond just car collectors. It also affected the value of many other classic cars within the community. This incident raised concerns that many cars, even if not sold by Rawlings, could still be suspected of being inauthentic, thus reducing the value of the entire classic car market. This created a huge shock in the industry, as collectors and investors began to approach their car purchases with more caution. Gas Monkey Garage, the brand that Rawlings had built over more than a decade, could not avoid severe decline after the fraud scandal was uncovered. Not only Gas Monkey Garage, but also other businesses associated with Rawlings, such as the Gas Monkey Bar and Grill chain, faced significant financial and reputational challenges. Within 24 hours of the verdict being announced, Gas Monkey Garage was hit with a media storm in an attempt to limit the damage. Gas Monkey Garage decided to undertake an emergency rebranding. All Gas Monkey signage, from logos to brand images, was removed from stores and business locations. Partner companies and service providers began to suspend their partnerships with Gas Monkey Garage, while former customers turned their backs on the brand. This not only affected revenue, but also significantly diminished the brand value that Gas Monkey Garage had once held, which had been a symbol in the automotive industry and the world of classic cars. Moreover, the Gas Monkey Bar and Grill outlets, a part of Rawlings' business empire, were also severely impacted. These restaurant chain, known for their Gas Monkey Garage-themed decor, were affected by the scandal as well. According to some restaurant staff, customer numbers plummeted immediately after the scandal broke, and many customers demanded refunds for services already rendered. Some outlets had to close, while others struggled to keep operations going. This created financial difficulties and left employees in the Gas Monkey Bar and Grill system facing job loss and uncertainty. One of the most severe consequences for Gas Monkey Garage and Rawlings was the loss of relationships with partners and customers. While classic car collectors felt deceived, business partners of Gas Monkey Garage, from auto parts companies to insurance firms, became worried about the authenticity of their transactions with the garage. This created a wave of distrust not only within the classic car community, but also in the business partnerships of Gas Monkey Garage. Richard Rawlings' fraud scandal did not only affect the classic car industry, but also had a far-reaching impact on the reality television industry. Fast and Loud, once a symbol of success and creativity in the classic car field, faced an irremediable crisis. Discovery Channel's decision to remove all episodes of Fast and Loud caused the show to lose a large portion of its audience and forced the reality television industry to face criticism about how these programs may have misled the public. For a show like Fast and Loud, where classic cars were introduced and restored in every episode, viewers had become immersed in the colorful and exciting world of the automotive industry. However, when Rawlings' scandal was exposed, it not only undermined the authenticity of the show, but also raised significant doubts about all reality TV shows that involve the faking or creating of situations. This could lead to a crisis of trust in reality television, forcing viewers and producers to reconsider the ethics and transparency of how these shows are produced after the long, intense trial. Richard Rawlings' case finally concluded, marking the collapse of an empire that he had spent a decade building. Richard Rawlings, once the founder of Gas Monkey Garage and host of Fast and Loud, was no longer the person the public had admired. His life, from his career to his finances and reputation, was now in crisis, with no possible way to recover. However, this scandal was not just a story about one man committing a crime, but also a great lesson for anyone who builds a brand based on public trust. One of the biggest questions people had after the verdict was read was why risk it all for a sophisticated act of fraud? Richard Rawlings was not the first person in the automotive or television industries to get caught up in scandal. But this case raised many questions about the authenticity of reality television shows, television stars, and their influence on shaping public images. Rawlings was once a symbol of success and passion for classic cars, but ultimately it was his greed and desire to push beyond limits that led to his downfall. Looking at this from a broader perspective, the scandal also made people reflect on the world of classic cars and their authenticity. For classic car enthusiasts, the value of a car is not only determined by its exterior beauty, but also by its history, authenticity, and origin. This fraud not only shattered the trust in a popular TV show, but also harmed the credibility of the classic car industry. Those who had purchased cars from Gas Monkey Garage, especially those who spent large sums of money on cars that were supposed to have historical value, now faced immense disappointment when they realized they had been deceived all along. The downfall of Rawlings was not only the result of a fraud case, but also the end of an era in the classic car industry. This industry, once seen as requiring deep knowledge and absolute precision, now faced an unprecedented crisis of trust. Collectors and classic car auction houses will have to be more cautious than ever when verifying the authenticity of the cars they are trading. This scandal sparked a call for reform in the classic car industry, pushing for stronger authentication standards and greater transparency to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. From another angle, Richard Rawlings' case serves as a cautionary tale for those in reality television and among celebrities. While it is possible to build a positive image and gain public admiration, the truth always has the potential to come out. This case shows that using one's fame and influence to deceive the public is not only illegal, but can also destroy an entire career and image. Rawlings not only lost all his wealth and career, but also faces an uncertain future for the next 15 years in prison. Ultimately, for those who once admired Richard Rawlings and Fast and Loud, this scandal was a huge shock. These people didn't just feel deceived, but also faced the collapse of the trust they had placed in someone they once saw as a hero in the world of classic cars. However, this is also an opportunity for the automotive and television industries to reconsider the ethical standards and level of honesty necessary when building public images. Rawlings' downfall is not just a story of deception, but a reminder of how public trust can be eroded if not protected properly. Looking toward the future, Gas Monkey Garage may never fully recover as it once was. The system and empire Rawlings built collapsed in a short time, and even if he could return after serving his sentence, it would be difficult for the brand to regain the respect it once had. This scandal will continue to haunt Rawlings' image for years to come, and it will remain an indelible part of the classic car industry's history. The big remaining question is whether Rawlings can find a way to rebuild his personal and professional life after this verdict. Nevertheless, rebuilding a brand or restoring a public image in such cases is nearly impossible, and Rawlings will have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. His story, from a beloved figure in the automotive industry to a revealed fraudster, will forever serve as a classic example of how reputation and career can be destroyed when integrity and honesty are lost. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next surprising and dramatic story.